2 hours apart. One moment, a man in shackles inside a New York courtroom says, "I am still president of my country." Another moment, thousands of miles away, a woman raises her hand in parliament and is sworn in as Venezuela's interim leader. I'm Caitlin Collins. And what you're watching unfold here is not just a legal case. It's not just a power transfer. It's a collision between sovereignty and force, between courts and aircraft carriers, between who holds power and who decides when it ends. Overnight, more than 150 aircraft and 200 U.S. personnel entered Venezuela. By morning, Nicolas Maduro was in U.S. custody, pleading not guilty to drug trafficking and terrorism charges. By afternoon, Delcy Rodriguez stood before lawmakers, calling it a kidnapping. If this feels unreal, it's because history rarely moves this fast. Stay with me, because once you understand how this happened, you'll start to see why it matters, not just for Venezuela, but for the rules that govern power itself. If this analysis helps you see the story more clearly, take a moment to engage, and let's go deeper. What makes this moment so volatile is not just who was removed, but how legitimacy is being rewritten in real time. On one side, the United States frames this as a law enforcement action, a surgical operation, they call it, a fugitive from justice apprehended, a leader accused of narco-terrorism, cocaine trafficking, and weapons conspiracies finally brought before a judge. On the other side, Venezuela calls it an armed attack, an illegal seizure, a violation of sovereignty carried out without consent, without mandate, and without due international process. And in the middle sits Delcy Rodriguez, sworn in not because an election demanded it, but because power suddenly left a vacuum. Her words matter. She speaks of pain, of kidnapping, of peace and tranquility, of cooperation, even with the very country that seized her predecessor. This is not a clean transition. It is a forced one. And when power changes hands this way, the real question is never who replaces the leader. It's what system made this outcome inevitable. To understand that, we need to go back not to Saturday night, but to the structure that allowed this moment to happen at all. To understand how Venezuela reached this point, you have to step back and look at the cycle that has defined its modern power structure. For years, legitimacy in Venezuela has not rested solely on ballots. It has rested on control of institutions, control of the military, and most critically, control of energy resources that the world depends on. The largest reserves on the planet create leverage and vulnerability at the same time. As international pressure mounted, accusations hardened. What began as political isolation evolved into legal framing. Not regime change, but prosecution. Not invasion, but enforcement. That shift matters, because it reframes a head of state not as a rival, but as a suspect. Once that line is crossed, traditional diplomacy weakens, courts replace negotiations, arrest warrants replace sanctions, and sovereignty becomes conditional, measured against external definitions of legitimacy. This is the mechanism beneath the shock. Not chaos, but escalation. Every step narrowed the path forward, until only one outcome remained possible: removal without consent, justified not by votes, but by charges. And when systems reach that stage, they don't collapse quietly. They rupture. And that rupture is exactly what we see in the first explosion of this crisis. The rupture became visible the moment the courtroom doors opened. Inside, Nicolas Maduro stood before a judge, not as a former leader, but as a defendant. 4 charges: narco-terrorism, cocaine trafficking, weapons conspiracies. And yet, his response was not legal. It was political. He didn't argue evidence. He asserted identity. I am still president. Outside that room, the symbolism was just as loud. A man in the public gallery shouted that he would pay. Maduro answered back, calling himself a kidnapped president, a prisoner of war. Moments later, he was led away in shackles, through a back door, beside his wife. That image matters, because power is not only exercised, it is displayed. And this was a deliberate display. Almost simultaneously, the United States defended the operation at the United Nations. Surgical, law enforcement, necessary. Venezuela's ambassador called it an illegitimate armed attack. 2 truths, 1 moment. If you're trying to process how fast this escalated, you're not alone. This is the point where legal language becomes a weapon, and spectacle becomes strategy. If this perspective is helping you connect the dots, stay engaged. Because what followed next wasn't chaos. It was calculation. What looks chaotic on the surface is underneath a carefully engineered mechanism. Start with the language. The United States does not describe Maduro as a deposed president. It calls him an illegitimate one. That distinction is everything. Because once a leader is labeled illegitimate, sovereignty weakens. The state no longer speaks with a single, protected voice. It becomes conditional. Then comes the second layer. Law enforcement framed as inevitability. Not a war, not an invasion, a surgical operation. Precision, necessity. This framing allows military force to wear the mask of legality even when more than 150 aircraft cross borders overnight. And finally, there is energy. The unspoken constant. The US ambassador's words at the UN were revealing. The world's largest energy reserves cannot be left in the hands of a fugitive from justice. This is not just about crimes. It's about stewardship, about who the system believes is allowed to manage resources that affect global markets. Put these pieces together and a pattern emerges. Legitimacy is redefined. Force is normalized. And transition is imposed, not negotiated. This is how modern power moves now. Quietly legal, loudly decisive. And once this mechanism is activated, it doesn't stop with one arrest. It accelerates. The second shot came not from the courtroom, but from the warning that followed. As it became clear Delcy Rodriguez would be sworn in, the tone shifted. No longer retrospective, no longer procedural. It turned forward and threatening. President Trump said she could pay a very big price, possibly bigger than Maduro's. Not if she committed a crime, but if she didn't, do what's right. That phrase matters. Because it signals that this crisis is no longer about one man in custody. It's about compliance, about whether a successor governs freely or under conditional permission. At the same time, Rodriguez struck a careful balance. She condemned the attack as illegitimate military aggression, yet she invited cooperation with the United States. Development, shared agendas. International law, every word measured, every sentence defensive. Outside Parliament, thousands gathered, not in confusion, but in loyalty, supporting Maduro, supporting his wife, supporting the interim president. The state apparatus held. The streets did not fracture. This is the second peak. Pressure without collapse. Threats without submission. And that's when crises become dangerous. Not when systems fall, but when they endure under strain. Because the longer this balance holds, the more force builds beneath it. And that force doesn't stay contained for long. If you're watching this from outside Venezuela, it can all feel abstract. Legal terms, diplomatic language, strategic warnings. But inside the country, this crisis doesn't live in courtrooms or UN chambers. It lives in homes. If you're a Venezuelan watching this, power didn't just change hands. Certainty disappeared. One morning, the president you were told was illegitimate is suddenly gone. By afternoon, a new leader speaks of peace while warning of aggression. And you're left asking a simple question. Who is actually in control of my future? Markets don't wait for answers. Families don't either. Economic tranquility isn't a slogan. It's whether food prices spike tomorrow, whether jobs remain, whether borders close, whether violence follows. That's why Rodriguez's words about spiritual and social calm matter. They're not rhetoric. They're reassurance aimed directly at you. And if you feel torn between defiance and fear, between pride and exhaustion, that reaction makes sense. Because when global powers collide, it's ordinary people who absorb the shock. If this story resonates with you, don't stay silent. Share it, talk about it, stay informed. Because understanding is the first form of protection. And what happens next won't stay confined to Venezuela. What's unfolding in Venezuela doesn't stop at its borders, and global actors know that. At the United Nations, the clash was immediate. Emergency session, sharp language, accusations of illegality versus claims of necessity. This wasn't just about one country, it was about precedent. If a sitting leader can be seized under the banner of law enforcement, every government with strained legitimacy is watching closely. Energy markets are watching too. The world's largest oil reserves don't exist in isolation. Any disruption, any transition imposed under pressure sends signals far beyond Caracas. Investors calculate risk. Governments reassess alliances. Rivals take notes. And then there's geopolitics. Allies of Venezuela see a warning. Adversaries see an opening. Neutral states see uncertainty. The question quietly circulating in capitals right now is simple. Is this a one-off or a new model? Because if sovereignty becomes conditional on external judgments of legitimacy, the rules shift. Power concentrates. Enforcement replaces diplomacy, and global stability starts to depend on who controls the definition of lawful. This is how local crises become global inflection points, not through explosions, but through acceptance. And once the world adjusts to a new rulebook, it rarely goes back. Which brings us to the hardest question of all. Where does this lead? From here, the future fractures into 3 possible paths, and none of them are theoretical. All are already forming. The first is the controlled transition. Rodriguez cooperates just enough to stabilize the state. Institutions remain intact. Energy infrastructure opens to outside repair. Tensions cool. Not because wounds heal, but because pressure eases. This is the best case outcome. Not peace, but manageability. The system bends without breaking. The second path is prolonged limbo. Rodriguez governs under constant threat. Legitimacy remains contested. Cooperation is selective. Protests simmer. Sanctions morph rather than disappear. Venezuela functions, but never freely. This is stagnation disguised as stability. And the third path is escalation. Cooperation collapses, pressure intensifies, new charges, new targets. The interim government becomes the next obstacle. Sovereignty hardens into defiance. External force returns not suddenly, but incrementally. And the country becomes a battlefield of legal, economic, and political attrition. These outcomes aren't driven by ideology. They're driven by systems, by how power now moves through courts, markets, and conditional legitimacy. History doesn't ask what's fair. It asks what's enforceable. And Venezuela is now standing at that intersection. One final step remains. This isn't just the end of a presidency. It's a test of a system that claims to balance law, power, and legitimacy. And today, that balance is visibly strained. A man in shackles says he is still president. A woman takes an oath with pain in her voice. A superpower promises to run a country until it decides the transition is safe. None of this fits neatly into the old rules. What matters now isn't whether you support Maduro, Rodriguez, or Washington. What matters is understanding the signal being sent. Leadership is no longer protected by borders alone. Legitimacy is no longer decided only at home. And enforcement has found new justifications. If you're watching closely, you'll notice something unsettling. This model doesn't require consensus. It requires acceptance. Once the world absorbs it, it becomes normal. That's why this story matters to you wherever you live. Because the tools used here don't stay local. They travel. If this analysis helped you see the deeper structure behind the headlines, stay with me. Subscribe, share this perspective, and be ready for what comes next. Because this isn't the last time power will change hands this way. It's the first time it felt this open.